As the years went by, the railroad proved to be a valuable asset to the colony. It was instrumental in opening up the interior for mining and logging operations, and provided a reasonably efficient link among the people of the province and with the mainland. Its operation was not in itself a financial success, and the politically popular but financially outlandish construction of numerous branch lines proved to be the straw to break the camel's back. 2 of the branch lines were never completed, and by 1938, 3 more had been abandoned. The financial drain proved to be too much for the Reed Company, and by 1923, the government had taken over the railway. Although essential to economic development, the rough terrain, combined with a small and scattered population, could never allow the line to pay its own way. When the government took it over, the roadbed and rolling stock were in poor condition. A program of upgrading was commenced, but it was hardly off the ground when the Depression hit. Then came the war, and the broken-down railroad was called upon to do a mammoth job. With the help of Lend-Lease rolling stock and a tremendous effort by all concerned, the job was done and done well. But by war's end, the system had deteriorated almost to the breaking point. Virtually no maintenance had been done during the war years, because every available locomotive was pushed to the limit, hauling troops and war traffic in addition to normal duties. When peace came, the rotted ties and decayed roadbed began to receive some attention. The locomotives were converted to oil firing, and things once again began to look up. But there was little time before Newfoundland became a province of Canada. A new era in the Newfoundland Railway story dawned when the narrow gauge system became a part of Canadian National Railways. 1949 was a year of many changes, and difficult adjustments were required on all sides. The railroad employees had to learn the CNR way of doing things, different operating rules, and the so-called proper procedure for everything. But for the National Railway Company, it was also quite the challenge.
Well, when CN did take over in '49, there were 2 basic problems it began to face, I suppose, right away. The first one was the technological problem. That was a narrow gauge railway with curves and grades that were very extreme compared to their experience on the mainland. And of course, Confederation brought a change in trade patterns too. Now goods began to come in from the Canadian mainland, so the tonnages coming across the Gulf were very considerable and accelerated rapidly. That re-emphasized the problem of grades and curves and narrow gauge. Also, the rails themselves were very lightweight. There were 70-pound rails across Newfoundland. And CN embarked on a program to increase the weight of the rail for further carrying capacity. Over these years, it's increased the amount of heavy rail so that most of it is now 100-pound rail or 85-pound rail compared to the original 70-pound.
The next step was dieselization. The 40 steam locomotives, some of which dated back to 1917, were retired and replaced with the new diesels. The newcomers had twice the pulling power of the steamers and could be operated in multiples by only 1 engine crew. Longer trains became the order of the day, and it was common to see 4 to 6 diesels pulling up to 100 cars over the steep grades. By 1956, dieselization was complete, and all but 1 of the steam locomotives had gone to the scrap heap. Number 593, built by Baldwin Locomotive Works in 1917, stands today in a park near Corner Brook, a silent memorial to a bygone era. The passing of steam was a blow to nostalgia. Frank Rogers' father was an engineer for many years. Today, Frank has an impressive model railroad in his basement, but his boyhood dreams were much bigger than that.
Well, I suppose I was so small first when I started going aboard those engines with my father. It was natural that I wanted to be a railroad engineer, and this is what I said I was going to be all the time. But eventually the day arrived when he simply told me I wasn't, and that was the end of that.
What do you remember most about riding the engines with your father?
I suppose it's the actual movement of the engines themselves. I wasn't very interested in the train. It was simply the engines, the way they ran. They seemed to be simply alive, and just the movement in comparison to a diesel, which is sort of rather stiff and dead. the smell was something else. The steam and the combination of steam and oil and coal just made that kind of a smell that you never forgot.
The passing of steam may have been a sad day for some, but compared to the blow that was to come a decade later, it was a minor incident. The express passenger trains, which took a day and a night to cross the island, rarely if ever exceeding 40 miles an hour, were on their way out. Officially known as the Overland Limited, and later the Caribou, Trains 1 and 2 acquired the affectionate nickname the Newfie Bullet. The term was coined by a visiting Allied servicemen during World War II, and it stuck. Though slow, the trains were comfortable and safe. In 71 years of operation, the Bullet never even seriously injured a passenger. And for years, the dining car on the Overland Limited enjoyed the reputation as the island's finest restaurant.
I suppose the railroad in Newfoundland Railway was a family affair, or at least the passengers looked on it as a family affair. I think the train crews felt that the people traveling on it had to be looked after. There was a real personal touch all the way. You knew everybody, and everybody knew everybody else, but it's certainly not like that, we'll say, on a mainland train where nobody seems to be interested in you at all.
How did you feel when the Newfie boat made its last run?
Well, really, I had been expecting it, and I got into many arguments with some of my friends about it because I believed at that time that the railway, the Newfie Bullet, had sort of run its course, that the people actually weren't traveling on it, and from an economic point of view, I couldn't see keeping the thing going. And I had implanted this in my mind before they took it out. So I really wasn't too upset or disappointed when it happened. It's sad to see it go, but I think I was sort of prepared for it from my point of view.
It was the completion of the Trans-Canada Highway across the island in the mid-60s that sounded the death knell for rail passenger service. The year the road was finished, ridership plunged over 30%, and the downward trend continued. The highway cut the traveling time between St. John's and Port aux Basques almost in half. It was inevitable that CN should seek to replace the Bullet with buses. There was a lot of political controversy, but the passengers told the tale. For a trial period in 1968, the railway operated both trains and buses. It was no contest. Journalist Jim Furlong worked on the Bullet that last summer.
Well, one thing is for certain, and that is that the people of the province certainly had their choice between the Bullet and the buses, and because the last full summer was summer of '68, and at that time the CN buses were operating on a regular basis across the province. I had worked the couple of previous summers and that summer on the Bullet in the dining car as a waiter and sometimes in the pantry. And the difference was remarkable. During the last summer, we'd go from St. John's to Port aux Basques and back again from Port aux Basques. And on occasion, we'd have 9, 10 passengers, perhaps. That's first-class passengers in the sleeper. That means we'd have a dining car crew of from 9 to 10 serving 9 to 10 passengers. So it was a very quiet summer. Most of the passengers, or a great many of them, were passengers from out of the province. It seemed there were very, very few Newfoundlanders who were choosing the Bullet over the CN buses.
The Bullet made its last run in June 1969. The buses, or road cruisers as CN called them, had won the battle. The traveling public might have liked the folksy comfort of the train, but in the end, they opted for speed. When the Newfie Bullet came off the rails, CN continued to operate a passenger service of sorts. Mixed trains on the branch lines carry a coach at the end because they run through areas not served by the road cruisers. Few passengers are carried on most trips, but there are exceptions. In the summer, tourists ride the mixed trains for a taste of something different, and there's the odd nostalgia seeker. On some special occasions, several coaches have to be added, and this is one of them. We're at the station in St. John's, about to take train 207 to Argentia, and today there's a big crowd. Many of them have never been on a train before. The engineer gets the highball, and we're on. The train follows the valley of the Waterford River out of the city, through scenic Bowring Park, and through the hills toward the shores of Conception Bay. It's a beautiful day, and we sit back to enjoy the scenery as the train rolls along the seashore. The main line follows the beach for about 10 miles, from Foxtrap to Holyrood, just a few yards from the high water mark. It's one of the longest stretches of level track on the whole system, and our train makes good time along this section. People at trackside turn their heads, for the romance of the railway is still strong, and the engineer's wave is sufficient to make the day worthwhile for the children who watch the locomotive rumble by. Holyrood lies at the very head of Conception Bay, about 30 miles from St. John's, and it's here that most of the passengers leave the train. Having enjoyed the novelty of the train ride, they'll take buses back to the city. After a short stop, we're off again, and now we tackle some of the steeper grades as we approach the Cat Hills. We round the horseshoe curve at North Arm and climb toward Woodford's, a grade where back in days of steam, it was frequently necessary to ascend with half the train, with the locomotive coming back for the remainder. We're crossing the interior of the Avalon Peninsula now through Avondale and Brigus Junction. Then it's Whitburn, headquarters for the Reed Newfoundland Company in the early days of railroading on the island. We leave the main line at Placentia Junction and head toward the ferry and coastal boat terminal at Argentia. The 22-mile branch shows bits of greenery between the rails, an indication of light traffic. There are only 3 trains a week over this line, but they come in handy for those with trackside cabins on the many ponds, who find the train a significant improvement over Shanks Mere. The Argentia Branch has some of the finest scenery on the island. It follows the hillside high above Placentia Gut and snakes its way through rock cuts so narrow that engine crews are warned not to lean out the cab windows. The branch is not without historic significance, as the celebrated Lord Beaverbrook rode it in a lowly caboose back in 1941, on his way to attend that famous meeting between Churchill and Roosevelt, which produced the Atlantic Charter. At Argentia, the cars of freight bound for the isolated communities along the south coast of the island are sent out near the wharf for loading on board ship. Then it's back to Whitburn for the night. Tomorrow, the train will travel down the branch to Carbonear before returning to St. John. The narrow gauge may be fun to ride, but railroads don't exist for the benefit of joyriders. With the emphasis on fuel economy these days, railroads seem assured of their place in the future. But the Newfoundland line isn't as economical to run as its standard gauge and heavier built mainland counterparts. In an effort to improve efficiency, Canadian National has introduced an innovative system known as truck-to-truck transfer. Loaded boxcars from the mainland cross the Cabot Strait in rail ferries, and on arrival at Port aux Basques, they undergo a transformation. Specially constructed hydraulic jacks lift the cars off the rails. The wheel assemblies, known as trucks, are removed, and narrow gauge trucks are substituted. The car can then travel on the narrow gauge lines, eliminating the costly and time-consuming process of transshipment. While this is an improvement, there are still drawbacks.
Even though we can bring mainland cars over and put them on Newfoundland car sets, the problem is that the Newfoundland car sets only have a capacity of 50 tons of freight, whereas the mainland car sets can carry 100 tons of freight. So there's the basic economic problem that you can only carry half the payload in Newfoundland that you can on the mainland. Now, that's been the continuing problem, and even with the truck-to-truck innovation, the fact still remains that the cost per ton mile in Newfoundland is much higher than it would be on the mainland.
One might think the obvious solution would be to rebuild the railway to standard gauge, but that isn't quite as simple as it sounds. Canadian National says the cost would be prohibitive, and the railway has opted to live with the limitations of the existing system.
At one point, they talked about it. In fact, several times over these years, they've talked about standard gauging. And figures are cast about by everybody. I'd name a figure without wanting anybody to hold me to it, but we're probably talking in the vicinity today of something like $300 million It's probably as good a figure as anybody's. And even back when it was first talked about, the size of the figure in magnitude related to the dollar value then was just as fearsome. It's not the sort of thing that CN could handle on its own. It would have to be a political decision, and it isn't a decision that I'd really expect to be made.
The Newfoundland Railway, built on a shoestring across a rugged country to serve a scattered population. A railroad that could never pay, yet without it, Newfoundland could never have developed to the extent that it has. But the service rendered by this line, which was never intended to be a first-class system, is nothing short of remarkable. Much of the credit must surely be due to the character of the men who ran it, from the days of the Reeds through the years of government operation and the Canadian National era. Though the Newfie bullet is long gone, it's still remembered with affection. And today, the narrow-gauge diesels continue to growl through the woods and along the seashore, up the steep grades and round the hairpin turns, pulling a significant proportion of the island's commerce, as the rails continue to be a vital link in the provincial economy.